In my opinion, this is Feminist Frequency's worst video.
So where do we even begin?
She argues her case poorly and at points fallaciously. She also does not seem to get what some of these stories are about. Instead, she oversimplifies them with a cynical attitude towards what writers are trying to accomplish.
One thing I love about speculative fiction is its ability to explore difficult topics. Because of its separation from our current time frame, it can comment on socioeconomic and cultural issues in really engaging and interesting ways. But one thing that I've learned from watching a lot of science fiction and fantasy television is you never, ever want to get pregnant on TV.
And one thing I have learned from watching a lot of science fiction and fantasy is that being male does not exempt you from becoming impregnated by an alien.
These storylines are almost always built around women who have their ovaries harvested by aliens, who serve as human incubators for demon spawn. Basically, the characters are reduced to their biological functions. Remember back in the mid-90s on The X-Files when FBI agent Dana Scully found herself abducted and forcibly impregnated, which of course later culminated in a hybrid human-alien child?
I absolutely remember The X-Files. In fact, when I was a young teenager, I was practically obsessed with the show. That's probably why I knew right away that there was something wrong with this example. Perhaps it's best explained by the people who actually made the show.
The mythology of the series, it didn't really blossom until an unexpected event late in season 1, which was the pregnancy of Gillian Anderson, the real-life pregnancy of Gillian Anderson, which forced The X-Files to be serialized in a way I don't think it was ever intended to be serialized. Suddenly there had to be an arc of stories that dealt with the fact that Scully was going to be gone for who knew how many episodes.
We knew we had a window where we had to write her out, and, fortunately, this is a show about abduction, so we abducted her.
So as we just heard, it was real life that preceded fiction, and the reason she was abducted is because it's a show about abduction. Why is this relevant? Let's return for a second to what she said at the beginning of the video.
One thing I love about speculative fiction is its ability to explore difficult topics. Because of its separation from our current time frame, it can comment on socioeconomic and cultural issues in really engaging and interesting ways.
As it so happens, entire books have been published on what The X-Files is about. To say that the show is about abduction is to say that it is a show that dramatizes the alleged experiences of people who claim to have been abducted by aliens. These real-life abductees very often claim to have medical experiments of one sort or another performed on them during their abduction experience. It would be fair to say that The X-Files is a show about the cultural fears and paranoia of contemporary American society. The show is drawing explicitly on elements of the real world and exploring them in the way that one would expect from speculative fiction. The basic logic is this. Real people claim to have had their reproductive systems experimented on by aliens. The X-Files is a show about abduction. They needed to write Gillian Anderson off the show. They abducted her. They used the story to further explore the idea of aliens experimenting on the human reproductive system. It was not an arbitrary choice. It was not done just to up the dramatic stakes. It is directly relevant to the central ideas of the show. It is the show exploring a difficult topic. It is also very important to note here that Scully's abduction was not a throwaway piece of the show. Her abduction became essential to the mythological arc of the show. The show's mythology arc also dealt with the concept of experimentation on human beings in general. The stories Paperclip and 731 make reference to the horrific experiments on humans done during World War II by the Nazis and the Japanese. In the episode Redux, Mulder is shown an entire room of women being experimented on the way Scully was. He was told that it was part of a massive military project to develop new biological weapons. Fear of the military-industrial complex is another cultural element employed by the X-Files. If I had to speculate where the sorts of fears that led to real-life abduction claims come from, it would be people's general fear of the dangers of science in the wrong hands. It draws on popular culture and alleged real-life experiences. Believe it or not, there have been actual women who have claimed to have given birth to alien-human hybrids. episodes. Anita seems to simply ignore the possibility that this is a case of speculative fiction doing what it's good at. What could be more difficult topic than people's anxieties over experimentation on humans and where genetics might go in the future? This leads me to a slight digression over what I take to be Anita's view of science fiction, because she seems to have a narrow view of what good science fiction is.
I love science fiction, and what I love most about it is this opportunity to imagine alternative societies and futuristic technologies that can improve our way of life and really be used as a tool for liberation.
Judging from this clip, Anita seems to have what, in layman's terms, we would call a Star Trek view of science fiction. Star Trek is a sort of Marxist fantasy in which technology has effectively ended material want, which frees humanity to spend their lives exploring the galaxy. Wanting science fiction stories to be about imagining tools of liberation would be to ignore what I might call the dark side of science fiction. More often than not, science fiction is about the complete opposite of what Anita says she loves about it. Instead of imagining utopian societies, it imagines dystopian societies. Instead of imagining technology being used to liberate, it imagines technology being used to oppress. When it's not dealing with outright dystopias, science fiction often deals with the anxieties caused by technology and the cultural changes which it brings about.
Our modern technology has achieved a degree of sophistication beyond our wildest dreams, but this technology has exacted a pretty heavy price. We live in an age of anxiety, a time of stress, and with all our sophistication, we are in fact the victims of our own technological strength. We are the victims of shock, of future shock.
Since the very first science fiction story, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the genre has dealt with an ambiguity towards scientific progress. The genre recognizes that the difference between liberation and oppression is not what technology or science is, but who is using it. Science fiction stories explore how it might all go wrong in the wrong hands, hence the mad scientist trope. Reality gives us ample reasons to pay heed to the dark side of science fiction. While it might be far more pleasant to imagine how we might construct technological utopias, the real-world effects of technology have been highly destructive. From the Luddites who smashed the machines who were making factory workers rich while putting people out of jobs, to the cotton gin's effect on slavery, to the atom bomb, the effects of technology have not always been good. Moreover, the underlying reasons behind technological development is often much more ambiguous than people inventing tools of liberation. While the internet may have many positive applications today, we should not forget that the concept of networking computers largely came out of the military and the nuclear defense system. It was ensuring the possibility of nuclear retaliation and not the possibility of sharing video blogs that led to the internet. To bring this back to the mystical pregnancy trope, while Anita may think that pregnancy is a sacred subject, science fiction recognizes that the potential dangers of science await us even in the realms of human reproduction. These dangers are all the more resonant with the audience because history has already shown that dangers are not merely hypotheticals. People like Dr. Mangala and Unit 731 remind us of the unspeakable violations of human beings, which people are capable of. Fear of how science might be twisted in evil hands in the future is part of what drives the genre. While it is great to marvel at the positive potentials of technology, we should not forget what Robert Oppenheimer said about technology.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
Then we have Gwen Cooper, co-star of the Doctor Who spin-off Torchwood, who was bitten by an alien one night, and the next morning she wakes up to find herself extremely pregnant with the alien spawn.
I have not seen all of the episodes which she mentions in the video. However, in the Torchwood episode to which she refers, the pregnancy of Gwen Cooper was an avenue through which the writers explored many subjects in relationships, such as what it's like to work for Torchwood while everyone else lives in the normal world, her relationship to her soon-to-be husband and family, etc. Gwen Cooper did not awake to find herself mystically impregnated on any random morning, but the morning of her wedding, which is where the story's drama comes from.
More recently, on the second season of Battlestar Galactica, Starbuck had her ovaries harvested by the Cylons in an attempt to create human Cylon embryos.
Here also, Anita fails to mention that the incident in question does play into the story arc as a whole and is not a throwaway piece. The show depicts Starbuck's emotional reaction to the incident. It does explain the insane reasons Cylons are doing it. Like the X-Files, the themes of Battlestar Galactica center on the potential dangers of technology and science. This aspect of Battlestar Galactica was probably influenced by the X-Files.
Deanna Troi from Star Trek The Next Generation is perhaps the quintessential example of the mystical impregnation trope, as her character's body and mind are regularly occupied, borrowed, violated, and invaded by alien beings. During Season 2, in the episode The Child, Counselor Troi is impregnated with a rapidly aging alien fetus by a flying ball of space energy. Imagine finding out you're pregnant, giving birth 36 hours later, raising the child within a day, and then it dies, or in this case, vanishes. We don't see Troi dealing with the long-term emotional ramifications of such a traumatic event, and the experience is never mentioned again throughout the series.
I think that there are 3 interrelated problems with this example. 1. Context. 2. Psychology. 3. Format. Context. Throughout the episode, the alien creature was influencing Troi's emotional state. Interestingly, it could be argued that this episode expresses a pro-choice point of view, because while Commander Worf wants to force an abortion, and Commander Data insists that the child must be born and studied, it is Troi who speaks up and makes her own choice. The flying ball of space energy chooses to abandon its human form and leave the Enterprise because it was endangering the lives of everyone on the ship. After shedding its human form and returning to a flying ball of energy, it telepathically communicates with Troi its intentions before floating back into space. In other words, Troi got some form of closure and it didn't actually die. Psychology. Given that the being was telepathically influencing Troi's emotional states, and the fact that it didn't actually die, we could rightly ask ourselves how much grief should she actually be in. Moreover, Anita's psychological expectations can be called into question on the grounds that they assume human psychology, and Troi is only half human. She is also half Beta Z, which is a race of telepathic people. Troi, although not fully telepathic, does have the ability to sense other people's emotions, which is what makes her such a good ship's counselor. Given her part alien biology, her empathic abilities, and her professional training, it would not be that outlandish to think that our intuitive ideas about how someone should react psychologically would not necessarily hold true in Troi's case. Format. As for the events never being mentioned again, I have one word. Episodic. If the show you are watching starts every episode with previously on, then you are probably watching a serialized show, which means that the story is constantly progressing. An episodic show, by contrast, usually starts with a cold opening that has the characters playing out a similar formula over and over. Star Trek The Next Generation is an episodic show, and as such generally avoids references to the events of previous episodes. Rare exceptions to this rule usually take the form of multi-episode stories, reoccurring characters or races, and when the plot otherwise directly calls for it. The majority of events that happened in Next Generation were never mentioned again. Troi's alien baby is not an exception, it's the general rule. Moreover, while I would not invoke the defense that it's just entertainment, I feel that Feminist Frequency's expectations of psychological realism are often misplaced. An episodic show, by its nature, defies our psychological expectations when we actually stop and think about it. At the start of each episode, the characters have returned to a sort of default state, no matter what happened in the last episode. This is in contrast to reality, in which we see a constant flux and progression. Bart Simpson has been 10 years old for over 2 decades. Realistically, every crew member of the Enterprise should be suffering from PTSD by the end of the 2nd season. The phrase, straining the gnat while swallowing the camel, also comes to mind, because Anita is basically saying, okay, telepathy and flying balls of energy and half-human ship's counselors, that I'll buy, but the fact that she was not depicted as sufficiently traumatized by the experience, now that I can't stand for. The fact that it's entertainment is not a blanket excuse, but it is not something that we should forget either. And we should adjust our expectations accordingly. Anita is someone who talks about critical media literacy, but seems to sell the audience short on its level of sophistication at every turn.
And my apologies in advance to my more religious viewers, because we really can't forget the original mystical pregnancy narrative, the Immaculate Conception. As the story goes, an all-powerful being descended from the heavens and impregnated a young woman with the Chosen One, destined to save Earth and the souls of humanity. Yep.
The Jesus story is not the first virgin birth story by a long shot. Also, Mary was told by an angel that she would be mystically impregnated by God, and this is something that she accepts willingly because she is so faithful. I would imagine that lumping this in with other stories which she describes as violating and degrading women's bodies would be highly offensive to the millions of people that believe that this story is true, but it would also not be an accurate representation of the story. I personally believe that this story is a myth, but I would still say that she's mischaracterizing it. Thanks, Feminist Frequency, for forcing me to defend religion.
The mystical pregnancy is one of the plot devices that I loathe the most, because while other tropes represent women in stereotypical ways, this one hits us on a biological level. Yes, some of us are physically capable of having babies, but no, that does not mean you get to take advantage of and abuse that for the sake of your story.
I want to note here that in spite of my defense of Star Trek, The X-Files, Battlestar Galactica, etc., I would not argue that what she is saying is completely wrong. It may well be the case that some of these examples have no deeper context or cultural background behind them. It is more than plausible that the writers could use the mystical pregnancy for a dramatic effect. My point is that along with the positives of science have come the fear that in the wrong hands, humans themselves might be turned into lab rats, and some of these stories are actually addressing issues in society, even if they're highly unpleasant ones. Now to her main argument about the mystical pregnancy trope.
Fanvidder Laura Shapiro calls the mystical pregnancy a type of reproductive terrorism because it makes becoming pregnant seem disgusting, frightening, and nightmarish. Laura goes on to say, the problem from my point of view is that pregnancy and birth are natural processes that are being distorted into torture porn, ways of punishing women, and exploiting their terror to up the dramatic stakes. This trope can't be brushed off as just entertainment. Human beings from the beginning of verbal storytelling have used narratives to understand ourselves and the world around us. When we hear a story repeated enough times, it can affect the way we think about reality. The mystical pregnancy is just another sexist narrative that exploits women for being female. These stories are especially striking at this point in American history because women's reproductive rights, which have always been threatened, are currently under vicious attack by conservative and religious groups. Some states are trying to pass legislation that will criminalize miscarriages, or make abortion procedures so strict and complicated that it renders them nearly impossible. Planned Parenthood is even in danger of being defunded through direct ideological attacks on women's ability to control what happens to their own bodies. So, all you Hollywood writers, you should feel real guilty right about now for continually using the tired old mystical pregnancy trope to violate and degrade women's bodies on television.
Let's examine this argument. The first problem is that it's a slippery slope argument. If you write mystical pregnancy stories, then people will think pregnancy is scary, and that will fuel conservatives and the religious right, who then will strip women of their reproductive rights. A slippery slope argument is a logical fallacy unless you clearly explain all of the logical connections, which she clearly does not. The second problem is that it is a non sequitur that belittles the sophistication of the audience. Why would people want to ban abortion if they believe that pregnancy is scary and they might get impregnated by a demon or an alien? Wouldn't their logic be, we need to keep abortion legal, what if I get pregnant by an alien? Moreover, while it may be true that narratives are used to understand the world, nothing so straightforward applies in this case. Generally, people understand that in real life they stand exactly no chance of being impregnated by a demon, alien, or god. Many members of the audience do not even believe in the existence of such entities. While George Bush's abstinence-only education may have left many people with a severely impoverished understanding of human reproduction, few people in the West are so ignorant that they would derive their views about human pregnancy from fictional television shows. Most people understand that pregnancy is a natural process, and it would take a very young child, a highly superstitious person, or a lunatic to confuse these scenarios for anything that might actually happen to them in reality. It's also rather dubious to assert that TV shows are morally responsible for people's ignorance. My third problem might seem a bit redundant at this point, but involves this clip.
The problem from my point of view is that pregnancy and birth are natural processes that are being distorted into torture porn, ways of punishing women, and exploiting their terror to up the dramatic stakes. This trope can't be brushed off as just entertainment.
The alleged motivation for these stories is being described with no reference to the context of the stories. It might be the case that lazy writers, out of good ideas, might be using the mystical pregnancy trope just to up the dramatic stakes. On the other hand, these stories might actually involve very real fears people have about the potential misuses of science, even in the realm of human reproduction, and might be exploring them in a way that science fiction is good at. When the motivation of writers are broad-brushed with cynical notions like that they are just doing it to up the dramatic stakes, that is thinking of it as just entertainment. In this scenario, writers are the ones that only care about entertainment and will write anything for the sake of keeping the audience in suspense, but it's the enlightened feminist media critic who sees the broader social implications. It's exactly this holier-than-thou attitude that does Anita exactly no favors whatsoever. My fourth problem is that Anita completely ignores the actual worldview that instigates most opposition to abortion.
These stories are especially striking at this point in American history because women's reproductive rights, which have always been threatened, are currently under vicious attack by conservative and religious groups.
To try and link these television shows to the religious right seems to me to be a mind-boggling stretch of reality. The religious right is not motivated by the stories on television, but the stories in the Bible. One of the distinctive features of evangelical Christianity in America is that they are a subculture not only totally opposed to abortion, but they have also constructed for themselves an alternative media reality which deliberately shuns mainstream entertainment in favor of their own shows, movies, books, and other forms of entertainment. It is from the pew and the pastor at church, and not from the couch and the glowing box in their living room, that most people are told to oppose abortion. Presented this way, Anita dangerously obfuscates the belief system of the religious right. Lastly, I would like to address this statement.
I sincerely hope that after this lesson, you will stop terrorizing your female characters with the magical demon impregnation from space storylines. You know, maybe you should just stop writing pregnancy altogether until you can do it with some respect and dignity and with the appropriate amount of emotional impact.
One of the recurring elements in what I mentally refer to as the Feminist Frequency Guide to Screenwriting is this idea that the emotional consequences of every action should always be elaborated on. I don't think that this expectation is well suited for many kinds of storytelling, especially visual media where the mind of the audience does much of the psychological work. As it happens countless times in movies and television shows, the full extent of a character's emotional reactions is left unshown in order to keep the story moving at a certain pace and keep the attention on the story as a whole. It is often up to the mind of the audience and the performance of the actors to convey the subtleties of emotional states. While Anita is demanding to place pregnancy on a pedestal, it is instructive to consider how television and movies as a whole deal with the emotional impact of other sorts of human events. Consider death, for example. It would seem obvious that in real life, death is at least every bit as serious as pregnancy. And yet one could point to countless examples on television and movies where death is not given respect and dignity and the appropriate amount of emotional impact. Weekend at Bernie's would be a good example. How the impact of an event is handled in a TV show or movie is usually determined by the degree to which they consciously strive for psychological realism. The nuances of human psychology are constantly glossed over to tell a story. If one expects to find psychological realism at every point in the story, then they will find nearly every television show and movie problematic. Again, I think this points to Anita's overstatement of how much fictional television impacts people's worldview. The audience is generally sophisticated enough to understand that fiction need not accurately reflect reality all of the time.